Hey everyone, it's Blake here with ChessPathways.com, and in today's video we're going to be taking a look at the Pirc Defense. The Pirc Defense is another king's pawn opening. White begins the game with pawn to e4, and black responds here with d6. So what's the point of this move? Black wants to put pressure on the white center from afar without committing their central pawns yet, and they don't want to play knight to f6 right away to attack this pawn. This would be the Alekhine defense, but they want to avoid getting hit with e5 here, having to move that knight again already. So instead they play d6 first. After white plays d4 and takes the center, black gets to play knight to f6, attacking the pawn. White usually defends it with knight to c3, and now black's often going to fianchetto this bishop. It doesn't have a very good path to develop the normal way here, so it's going to come to g6, to g7, where it's going to put a lot of pressure here on the white center. It should be noted here that if black does not play g6, black does have a couple other setups here. For example, black will sometimes play knight b to d7 followed by e5. For example, knight f3, e5. But I would not really consider this a Pirc defense. This is just a symmetrical king's pawn opening here. This is a Philidor defense, just with a different move order. But you could easily reach this position if black had played e5 on move 1. After g6, this is when I would really consider this the proper Pirc defense. Now, in every opening system in chess, you have to strike a balance between understanding the concrete variations, the memorized moves of that opening, and then understanding the ideas. And in the Pirc defense, the ideas are more important than ever because there's no pawn tension here right away. In a lot of openings, like say the French or the Caro-Kann, you get very early pawn tension when this black pawn attacks the e4 pawn, and white has a very limited number of ways to respond to that, and we can kind of narrow down the study of our opening based on those options. Or there's other openings like the symmetrical king's pawn opening e4, e5, where the pawn structure becomes very fixed, very rigid right away. And again, both sides only have so many options there, but in the Pirc defense, black's kind of giving white a free hand to develop however white wants to. Black's not challenging white's central dominance right away. White's allowed to take the full center here, the e4 and the d4 square with their pawns, and black's just going to develop from afar, put pressure on the center with the bishop, get castled very early, and then black will decide how they want to proceed from there. There's some lines where black eventually challenges the center with c5, sometimes with e5, sometimes even with d5 later. But that challenge to the white center is going to come much later. So this affords both players a great deal of flexibility. There's tons of possible continuations for how the game can go here, even over the course of just the next 3 or 4 moves. But today, we will examine some of the most popular options to give you a flavor for how the Pirc defense can progress. So let's start by talking about one of white's most aggressive options, and that's the Austrian attack. When white plays f4 here, taking even more central space and menacing at the possibility of playing e5 in the near future. By the way, playing e5 right away doesn't make much sense. It is supported by that d-pawn, but it's not going to be very successful. For example, after black simply exchanges there, black can exchange the queens. The knight should probably take so white can preserve castling rights. And after really any knight move here, let's just say knight to d7, adding some pressure to this e5 pawn, white doesn't have really a meaningful space advantage. This pawn's going to come under heavy fire with this bishop and this knight, and black's not going to have any trouble developing here, especially with queens off the board. So in light of that, white plays this move f4 here, the Austrian attack, possibly threatening to play e5 later. Black will usually play bishop g7. Knight to f3 is white's main move here. White could consider playing e5 right away, but black can often meet this in the Pirc defense with knight f to d7, and it's not so clear what white has achieved. Black's generating a lot of pressure here on this pawn, and white can't really make anything happen here right away. Moves like e6 or e takes d6 don't really accomplish anything. White would probably have to play knight f3 here anyway, so white usually remains flexible and just starts developing first before playing e5. So knight f3, and black has 2 main options here as well. Black can either castle, or black can strike at the center right now and play c5. So let's look at this c5 option for the purposes of this example. It's a good illustration of how black can try to fight back in the center. And if white takes here on c5, at first this looks bad for black because after black recaptures, white would be able to stop black from castling. But black's not going to recapture right away. Black's going to play queen to a5, and this is a very common idea in the Pirc defense. Pinning this knight and threatening knight takes e4. And after white prevents this threat, let's say with bishop d3, developing a piece to defend this pawn, Now black can go ahead and recapture with the queen here on c5. Black gets the pawn back, and we actually end up with a pawn structure here that you might recognize from the Sicilian defense, where white has exchanged his d-pawn for black's c-pawn, and just as in a lot of Sicilian lines, this dark squared bishop is doing a great job exerting a lot of influence down this diagonal. Instead, after c5, white's most popular move is bishop b5 check, exploiting the fact that the black king has not castled yet. If black were to play a move like knight b to d7, once black plays this move, now white starts thinking about e5 a lot more seriously, because this knight's retreat square has been taken away, and knight c6 d5 looks pretty annoying, so black will usually respond with bishop d7. And now white usually chooses to play e5, now that this retreat square has been taken away. And there's a line here that continues knight to g4, and white often continues with e6 here. Bishop takes d7 is another possible move here for white, but e6 is white's most popular move, with some interesting ideas here. The bishop can't take because of the pin, and if the f-pawn takes, then knight g5 might be an idea, threatening knight takes e6, again because of the pin, and also putting this knight under discovered attack here by the queen. So it's a temporary pawn sacrifice here from white, but after e6, black does not have to take that pawn right away. Black can play bishop takes b5. White will throw in e takes f7, a nice little in-between move to try to stop this king from castling. And black should probably not take this pawn, because then knight g5 might come with check, and this knight would be hanging. So king d7, believe it or not, is the most popular move here, with the point that after knight takes b5, black's going to be able to play queen a5 check, and then c takes d4, and this knight would be pinned here. After knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, and white's not going to be able to pick up both of these pieces. After queen takes d4, for example, knight to c6, and black's position looks a little suspicious here with the king on d7 and this pawn here on f7, but this pawn will often be picked up later. It's pretty hard for white to defend it. Black was able to connect these rooks, and the white queen is under attack. It's certainly still going to be an exciting game from here. So as you can see, going back here to move 4, the Austrian attack does lend itself to more forcing memorized lines than a lot of other possibilities because of how aggressive it is. If black especially plays the most aggressive continuation himself, playing this move c5 before black castles, there can certainly be some very sharp lines that both players should be aware of. So that was a quick glance into the Austrian attack here with f4. Another possible setup for white is to try to castle queenside, so that white can use the kingside pawns to launch a pawn storm against the black king. The king's almost always going to castle kingside for black, because black can very quickly play bishop g7 and castles, and in this setup white can play bishop e3, bishop to g7, queen d2, again intending to castle long. This is the so-called 150 attack. Definitely often leads to some very aggressive attacking and counter-attacking games. Black often plays c6 here, not only helping to control this d5 square, but also black might want to play b5 and get their attack rolling on the queen side after white castles there. f3 is a popular move for white here. This is very typical in a lot of kingside pawn storm kind of setups. We know this from a lot of lines in the Sicilian defense, where this pawn not only helps to stabilize the white center, but it can also be a launching point for white's pawn storm, or white's going to play g4 and h4, and this pawn helps control the g4 square. Black sometimes plays b5 here. Black's kind of delaying castling for the time being, keeping white guessing, and just kind of accelerating their attack here on the queen side. And just to show one sample of how the game can go, let's say white castles long, black castles short, bishop h6, white's trying to eliminate this very powerful g7 bishop, which not only is a great influence on the center and queen side, but is also a great defender of the black king here on g8, so white wants to eliminate it. Black plays queen a5, king b1. White wanted to make sure that black can't just play b4, kick the knight away, and then win the a2 pawn. That wouldn't be good. So king b1, b4, the knight comes back to e2, knight b to d7, black's just finishing up development. And the opposite side castling here basically guarantees a very exciting game to follow, where white's going to be attacking on the king side, and black will do the same on the queen side. Just to show one alternative, sometimes white will try to play g4 before they castle, and here, since black hasn't castled yet, black sometimes considers playing h5 here, kind of challenging this pawn storm head on. And if white were to exchange here on h5, then they're kind of opening this rook's file, they're kind of splitting up their pawns here on the king side. Black might just not castle, they might just take with the knight, And now it's much harder to get any kind of pawn storm going there on the king side. So often after h5, white responds with g5, kicking this knight away from its best square, which is kind of inconvenient for black. White still gets a big space advantage on this side of the board, but white has committed to kind of closing some lines off here by playing g5, and it might take longer for white's attack to materialize because these lines are closed. They can no longer really use this pawn lever here to open the files here because that pawn has pushed past black's h-pawn. So far we've looked at the Austrian with f4, we've looked at the 150 attack where white tries to castle queenside. Let's consider this move bishop to g5. This is another very ambitious option for white. White will often follow up by playing f4 very soon, but white wants to get this bishop out of the pawn chain and activate it first, because in the Austrian attack, that bishop will usually sit on c1 or d2. Here, white wants to get this bishop active first. So, bishop g7. White has a couple moves here. White sometimes plays the more flexible queen d2, but let's consider f4. Black can castle, knight f3. Black can consider playing c5 here and striking at the center. And here white might play d5, and black has to be careful of white following up with e5, kicking this knight away. We're going to see another purpose to this bishop being here active on g5. Let's say, for example, black did nothing really for the time being. They just played a6, preparing b5. If white played e5, black would not be able to retreat here with knight to d7 because of this pin to the e-pawn. White would be able to play e takes d6, and this could be very bad for black. So after knight f3, c5 is an option, but black will often play c6, again, just taking some more squares here in the center under control, and possibly getting ready to play b5. And now queen to d2, b5. Now black has a threat here. Black's threatening to play b4, kick this knight away, and then this e4 pawn would be undefended, so white has to address that. Bishop to d3. Black now often develops this bishop to g4, and again, we get a very typical position for the Pirc defense. White has control over the center for the time being. White's able to develop essentially however they want to, but black's trying to put pressure on this center from afar with moves like possibly b4 later, kicking the knight away, possibly c5 later. This bishop's bearing down on this d4 point. And meanwhile, the black king is actually pretty safe for the time being, tucked away here nicely behind this dark squared bishop. And again, both sides have a great deal of flexibility. One more aggressive option white has to take on the Pirc defense is bishop c4, and this move is often associated with white trying to play e5, and after this knight moves away to follow up with e6 later on with the support of this bishop. Let's take a look. Bishop g7, knight to f3. Here again, black has several options. Black can certainly castle right away. c6 is actually a pretty popular move here. And now we kind of see a downside to this bishop being on c4. It's kind of walking right into the path of black's expansion over here on the queen side. Black might be able to play b5, kick the bishop, and then b4 next turn, kick the knight. And that bishop being there kind of accelerates that plan from black, because they get to play b5 with the tempo. Bishop b3 is the most popular move here, kind of preempting that idea. And now black will usually castle, getting that king to safety before anything dangerous can happen here on the f7 square based on e5, e6, or any idea like that. And white will usually castle here too, and the game will just kind of go from there. If black's careful, it's kind of hard for white to make use of any immediate tactic based on the f7 pawn or e5, e6. It's just an idea that black has to kind of keep in mind. For example here, after c6, if white played e5 too early here, black could just take, and if white exchanges with the pawn, the queens come off the board. After knight takes e5, white does succeed in generating a threat here to f7, but black could simply castle, let the rook help out in defending f7, and this doesn't look too dangerous for black. They're going to be able to still expand on the queen side here and put pressure on the white center. And the black king is not in any immediate danger. Alright, so far we've covered white's most aggressive, ambitious options against the Pirc defense. We've looked at f4, the Austrian attack. We've looked at bishop g5 and then f4. We've looked at playing bishop e3, queen d2, and castle long, and then launching a pawn storm on the king side. That's the 150 attack. And finally, the least popular of these very aggressive options, this bishop c4 line, simply because it kind of stands in the way of black's expansion, and it's kind of hard to make white's idea work here to really pressure the f7 square and this diagonal if black's careful. So those are four very aggressive options to play against the Pirc defense. Let's talk about some of white's more calm positional options. One such system is the fianchetto variation, where white plays g3, and fianchettos their light squared bishop here. The game might progress bishop g7, bishop g2. Black can go ahead and castle, knight g to e2. And black will often here play e5 and strike at the center with the e-pawn. Now that they don't have to worry about white exchanging here on e5 and wrecking their castling rights by exchanging queens, now the rook would just be able to recapture. And this has the nice added bonus of kind of stopping this e-pawn's advance, making sure this bishop's diagonal doesn't get opened, and black kind of takes their share of space there in the center. But white still has a great deal of central control here. White often plays h3 in this position, just making it hard for this bishop to develop actively. Also, white might want to play bishop e3 next, and they don't want to get hit with knight g4. And white's king will certainly be very safe here on g1 behind this bishop after white castles. So if you prefer playing more positionally, you might want to consider playing the fianchetto system here against the Pirc defense. Finally, knight f3 is a very popular move here. And after bishop g7, white has several ways to handle this. Bishop e2 is a very popular move. Just getting ready to castle, not putting that bishop on c4, because we talked about how that can accelerate some of black's plans there to play c6 and b5, or c6 and d5. When I used to play this knight f3 line against the Pirc, though, I always played h3 here. That's another very popular system. Just, again, taking this g4 square under control, and that's very useful here. Black's knight and bishop might both want this square at some point, so it makes sense to take it under control. Black can go ahead and castle. Now bishop e3, now that we don't have to worry about knight g4, and this also helps discourage black from breaking in the center with c5. Black can play c6, and now a4. This is very common in a lot of these positional lines. We're not trying to, roll black over in the center with f4 and e5. We're just playing very positionally. We're stopping black's expansion here with b5 for the time being, and white maintains their full control here of the center. Just to show one possible continuation, let's say black plays knight b to d7, developing that knight. White often here plays a5, just expanding even more on the queen side and also taking away the b6 square here from the knight and the queen. Queen c7, bishop e2, white goes on with their development, and now black plays e5, striking finally at the white center and taking some space for himself. And a positional game is going to proceed from here. Again, neither side's going to get some huge attack on the other side's king right away. The game is going to take a more positional approach. Alright, thanks very much for watching. I hope you learned something about the Pirc defense today. And if you haven't signed up on chesspathways.com yet, please visit chesspathways.com, type it in right now, and get signed up. Totally free, only takes a couple seconds, and I will send you a free move-by-move guide to chess thinking when you join. I'm trying to help more players become chess masters, and I want you to be the next success story. Thanks, and I'll see you there.